My special guest this morning is a ready Presidential Distinguished Professor of Economics and John S. Hinckley Fellow at Weber State University. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and an attorney licensed to practice in the Supreme Court of the State of Utah, the Supreme Court of the United States. His new book, Protecting Minority Rights in African Countries, a Constitutional Political Economy Approach, was published by the Edward Edgar Publishing House. Professor John, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I'm so happy to have you. I was looking forward to having you on the show to talk about this new book. Your book analyzes the main challenges of constitutional design and the construction of governance institutions in Africa today. What is the story behind this book? And when did you conceive the idea for this book and what you consider to be its central argument?
It took me 5 years to research, write, and publish this book. The book is part of the research that I have been doing in Africa since 1985, when I completed my PhD work. Most of that research has been devoted to finding ways to improve governance in each African country, which I believe is very important for peaceful coexistence. And the main reason is that without peaceful coexistence, it's not possible for an African country to create the wealth that it needs to confront poverty and improve living conditions for its people. Part of the problem that we see in Africa today when it comes to economic growth and the creation of wealth is the lack of peace and security. It's very difficult to convince people to engage in entrepreneurial activities or invest their savings in productive activities if they don't feel secure. Even in terms of foreign investment, it's very difficult for a country to bring in foreign investment if foreign investors are afraid that war would break out or sectarian violence would break out and they will lose their investment. And so one of the things that we need to understand is that in order to promote economic growth and economic development, you have to have peace and security. You have to have peaceful coexistence. And one of the things you see is that in virtually every African country, you have groups that are either identified by religion, for example, Muslim groups, Christian groups, or you have groups that are identified by ethnicity, some kind of an identity, like the Igbos in Nigeria, or the Yorubas in Nigeria, or the Kikuyu in Kenya. And you see, these groups were brought together forcefully through colonialism to form what we now have as African countries. So when you look at Kenya, you see that Kenya is made up of several ethnic groups that were actually independent, groups that were existing independently before colonialism came along. Or you look at Nigeria, over 250 ethnic groups that were living independently, interacting with each other through trade. The Igbos, for example, traded with the Yorubas. The Hausas traded across the boundary into Cameroon, into what is now Cameroon. And so these groups were existing independently. They had languages of their own. They had governments of their own. They had traditions of their own. They had customs. But when colonialism came, it brought all these groups together to form what were colonies, like the colony of northern Nigeria, the colony of southern Nigeria, or the colony of Kenya. And you see, many of these colonies became independent countries. And so the problem that they faced after they got independence was how to live together peacefully and promote economic development. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do is to study how these groups can get together, provide institutions, laws and institutions that can allow each group within the country to maximize its own values. For example, promote its own culture, promote its own language, but at the same time, participate in national development. That is one of the focuses of my book. Now, if you look at a country like Cameroon, in addition to the fact that Cameroon is made up of several ethnic groups, Cameroon also has that divide in which you have Anglophones and Francophones because of the French colonialism and English colonialism. So Cameroon is made up of two distinct groups, Anglophones, who also constitute several ethnic groups, and Francophones, who also constitute several ethnic groups. But what has happened in the last, since the two groups came together in 1961, is that the Francophones have dominated both the government and the economy. And in the process, they've pushed the Anglophones to the economic and political margins. And so the Anglophones consider themselves a minority because the government is controlled primarily by the more numerous Francophones. And so what has happened in Cameroon is that there's been this struggle during the last several decades by Anglophones to participate in government and the economy. And so that failure has led to the conflicts that you have in that country today. So what my book seeks to do is to help African government guarantee the rights of all these groups that live within each country. That is the right to self-determination, the right to participate in the economy, the right to participate in the government. So when you look at a country like Nigeria, you see that there are many groups within Nigeria that argue that since independence, they have not been able to participate in government, that the government has been dominated by just a few large groups, and that the smaller groups have been deprived of an opportunity to promote their own culture, to develop. And you see this problem all over Africa. And that is one of the reasons why you see all this sectarian violence in Mali, for example, where the Tuaregs are fighting the government, or in Libya, where you see the struggle between different groups, or in South Sudan, where the Nuer and the Dinka are fighting over control of the government, or in Ethiopia, where you see the people in Tigray fighting the central government, and so on and so on. So one of the things that I've tried to emphasize in the book is that governments in Africa have to be able to provide opportunities for all groups, not just one group, for all groups to participate in every aspect of development, in education, in skills development, in health, in governance, and so on and so on. Unless you can do that, you're going to not only be unable to develop the country, but you continue to have these problems that occur year after year with respect to groups that are fighting to assert themselves.
Minority rights are often perceived as a Western concept. And this view relies on the fact that while the notion of a national minority might make sense in Europe or in Canada, for example, in the African context, the concept has little resonance. Several factors explain this perception of minority rights, including the use of ethnicity during the colonial era, but also the perceived Western background attached to the international framework of minority rights, which has created strong distrust. What's your understanding of the terms minorities and minority rights?
It is true. Well, even if we agree that the concept of minority rights was developed in the West, that does not mean that it has no relevance in the African context. And one thing that we have to understand is that, yes, ethnicity may have been invented by the Europeans as a way to split Africans during the colonial period in what some people have referred to as the divide and conquer process. So it is true, but what we have to understand is that those groups that the Europeans came and started designating as tribes or ethnic groups, those groups existed. They were there. Whether you call them ethnic groups or tribes is irrelevant here in our discussion. And the reason is, if you look at a country like Ghana, there are distinct groups that have existed for centuries. You look at a country like Nigeria, there are distinct groups that have existed for centuries. If you go to, if you look at the history of Nigeria, groups like the Yoruba have been existing in that part of the world for many, many centuries. They are there. The Europeans, when they came, those groups were already there. In Kenya, the Kikuyus were there for years. In South Africa, the Zulus, we see Zulu history going many, many, many years. Then the Bele, many, many years of history. The Tigray people in Ethiopia, dating back centuries. So those groups were there. The fact that the Europeans came and started calling them ethnic groups or tribes doesn't really change the fact that those groups were there. So what happens is that after independence, the new African government did not sit down and try to ask this particular question that they should have asked, and that is, okay, we find ourselves in a situation in which we have all these groups that were brought together through colonialism. So you are the government in Nigeria, and you're asking yourself, okay, we have more than 250 groups that were brought together through colonialism. So the question is, it really doesn't matter what the groups are called, whether they're called tribes or ethnic groups, doesn't matter, because the groups are there. And these groups identify themselves with a culture, with a tradition, with a language. The Ogoni people in the Niger Delta of Nigeria, for example, consider themselves a distinct group. They have their own language, they have their own culture. So do the Igbos and the Yorubas and the Hausas and the Fulani and so on and so on. So you are Nigerian government. So the question you should be asking yourself is, how are we going to form a nation of these groups and move ahead and develop? You see, that question was never asked. And as a result, the institutions that the Nigerians came up with, and this is a problem that you see throughout Africa, the institutions that the post-independence countries came up with were institutions that allowed certain groups to dominate the government. In Cameroon, the Francophones dominated the government. In Nigeria, 3 groups dominated the government, and all the other groups were marginalized. They were not given an opportunity to participate in government and the economy. And so over the years, they were marginalized. And so the problem becomes, what happens to those groups? And so what has happened is that many of those groups consider themselves minorities because they are not part of the governing, part of the governing majority. So when you go to Kenya, for example, as I'll explain later on, you see that from 1963, when Kenya gained independence, government has been dominated by just three groups, whereas Kenya has over 40 ethnic groups. So all these groups that are excluded from government and the economy, they consider themselves like the Ogonis in the Niger Delta, minority groups, and demand their governments to provide them with special rights and special opportunities for self-actualization, for self-determination. And the reason they're doing that is because if you look at all the development that has taken place in Nigeria since 1960, most of these groups have not benefited. The same thing that you see in Cameroon, most of the Anglophones have not benefited. In fact, when you go to Nigeria and you go to the Niger Delta, you see not just the fact that most of the people are poor, but also the fact that most of the areas where the people live in have no development. They have few schools, they are struggling, the healthcare system is really bad, and most of the development is limited to certain areas of the country. So yes, your question is, this issue of minority rights is a Western concept. Does it belong in Africa? The answer, of course, is yes, it belongs in Africa, because even though you might say it is a foreign invention, it belongs in Africa because certain groups that consider themselves minorities, because they don't participate in the majority that is governing the country. Many of those groups are marginalized and pushed to the margins of the economy, the margins of the political system, and are barely able to survive, primarily because many of them do not participate in government. Now, we can look at a few countries. When you think of South Africa, you know that South Africa has a very unusual history. In 1950, the apartheid government of South Africa divided the population into 4 groups: white, African, colored, and Indian. You see, here in South Africa, there's a big difference in that the minority, that's the whites, were in the minority in terms of population. They were the ones who were ruling the country and exploiting the majority. So there, you see exploitation, tyranny by the minority, as opposed to exploitation and tyranny by the majority. You see, so South Africa divided its population into 4 parts simply for the reason of promoting white supremacy. Now, when you look at Nigeria, the population wasn't divided into 4 parts to promote some kind of supremacy. It was divided into several parts because when the colonial government formed Nigeria, it simply brought together groups that were already existing by force and produced what is now Nigeria. Whereas in South Africa, the apartheid government created those groups specifically to promote white supremacy. And so what they did was, after creating the 4 groups that I just mentioned, the government then gave them rights that were different from each group. So white people had the best citizenship rights. They had the right to marry, for example, and their marriage recognized by the government. They could marry anybody they wanted to, whereas Africans, for example, were not allowed to marry anybody they wanted to. White people could live anywhere they wanted to, whereas Africans were not allowed to live anywhere they wanted to. So there in South Africa, you see the tyranny by the minority as opposed to tyranny by the majority. So, but when we look at other African countries other than South Africa, the division into groups should not be taken lightly, because here you have a group of people, or rather you have groups of people who are living independently. They have their own cultures, they have their own economic systems, they have their own religions, and then somebody comes along and forces all of them into one bundle and calls them a colony. Now you have independence. And the question is, what do you do? You see, the simple answer is you provide institutions, laws and institutions that will allow every group to be able to maximize its own interest without preventing another group from doing the same. You see, this is the thing that African countries failed at independence to do. They did not do that. The institutions that they provided themselves, most of which were based on colonial constitutions, those institutions allowed certain groups to dominate the government and the economy, and in the process, marginalized other groups. And so that is the problem that we have in Africa today. The failure at independence to create institutions and laws that would have provided equal opportunity for all groups. It is true, and this is what I emphasize in the book. It is true that some groups at independence were more developed than others. And part of the reason has to do with an accident of history. If you study African history very carefully, you discover that, excuse me, take Kenya, for example. Those groups that were very eager to accommodate the colonialists, like the Kikuyus in Kenya, or the Yoruba in Nigeria, those groups ended up being developed more when independence came. You see, so if you look at Nigeria, you see that most of the educated people at independence were Yorubas and Igbos, because they were among the groups that welcomed the Europeans at a greater level. They were also the groups like the Yorubas that were located around the sea coast, had the first contact with the Europeans. They adopted European ways, formal education, English. Whereas the groups further inland, like the groups in the north, they are less educated simply because of the accident of colonialism. And so when independence came, what the government should have done was to take that into consideration and design policies that would have allowed for all groups to have greater opportunity for education, skills development, and economic development. And if the African government had introduced these kinds of policies and institutions, you would not have needed to talk about minorities, because everyone would have had an opportunity for self-actualization, an opportunity for education.
Participation in government.
Right, to participate. Then you would not have had that problem. You are having that problem today. The reason many groups within Africa are rising up and saying that we are minorities, we need special protection, is because most of those groups historically have been excluded from participation in economic and political processes.
In the recent years, several African countries have adopted new constitutions, leading to what has been characterized as a constitutionalism revival. From 2000 to about 2015 alone, at least 10 countries have adopted a new constitution. In parallel to such movements of constitutionalism, the continent has witnessed some serious ethnic tensions, regardless of all that progress. What have been the major challenges to achieving peaceful coexistence on the continent through constitutional designs that assure the protection of minority rights?
This is a very good question. You see, as we've been discussing, many African countries are the way many African countries are constituted is an accident, usually an accident of colonialism or an accident of history. And so the biggest question or the biggest problem that these countries faced at independence was how to live together peacefully, how to manage diversity, either ethnic or religious diversity, and provide opportunities for all citizens, all groups, to participate in national development. The most effective way to do so is to provide laws and institutions that allow each group and each individual to pursue their interests without preventing another group of individuals from pursuing their interests. Similar to what you see in the US today, where, excuse me, as I was telling some of my students who come from Zambia, Malawi, and Nigeria, I was telling them that, look, you can come to our university here, you can come to the US from Zambia, from Malawi, from Nigeria, okay? And you have an opportunity to get a good education here and go out and get a good job and fulfill all your dreams. Nobody is standing in your way except your laziness. If you're not willing to study, nobody stands in your way. The fact that you come from Nigeria and you're Igbo, or you come from Zambia, or you come from Zimbabwe, it doesn't matter. University, and you have an opportunity to get a good education, and after you get your education, you can go back to your own country, or you can go to someplace else, and you'll be able to maximize all those dreams that you've thought of. This is what African countries should have done at independence. provide a system in which education, healthcare, jobs in the public sector, jobs in the private sector are not dependent on what ethnic group you belong to. Okay, so that many countries fail to do that. They fail to provide those institutions. So by the 1980s and the early 1970s and 90s, there were a lot of so-called grassroots movements throughout Africa to change national constitutions, national institutions, to make possible this approach to development. This process in which every citizen of a country, regardless of where they came from, would have an opportunity to go to school, an opportunity to become an entrepreneur, an opportunity to work in government. So that government would not be dominated by any special group, or the military, for example, or the police would not be dominated by any special group. So many countries in Africa started these constitutional changes, okay? The constitutional changes were supposed to help them design new constitutions that would allow all citizens to participate in politics and in the economy. And many countries did come up with new constitutions. Cameroon came up with a new constitution in 1996, Kenya in 2010, South Africa in 1996, and so on and so on. So many of these countries were coming up with new constitutions. And the idea was that these constitutions would provide for a separation of powers. So you have an executive, you have a legislature, and you have a judiciary. And this would be independent, but they would check on each other so that the things that happened in the past, for example, the domination of government by one ethnic group would not happen, because now you have free elections in which anyone, whether you belong to a very small ethnic group or you belong to a large ethnic group, you could compete and become the president. You could participate in the judiciary. You could participate in the legislature, and so on and so on and so on. You see, the unfortunate problem is that even though these countries did come up with those constitutions, and the constitutions did have this separation of powers, supposedly with checks and balances, in reality, the constitution didn't function the way they were supposed to. And I can give you a very good example. Cameroon had a new constitution in 1996. It was a revision of the constitution of 1972. And that constitution in 1996 created an executive, a judiciary, and a legislature. But the problem is that the president, based on how the constitution was designed, controlled the other two branches of government. You see, he wasn't supposed to do that, because that's not the way the system is supposed to function. But he was able to control the other two parts of the government. For one thing, under that new constitution, the Supreme Court was located in the Department of Justice, which is an executive department. And so the president was able to control the Supreme Court. In addition to that, the president's party also controlled the legislature. That is why, even though the president was supposed to serve only 2 terms, that constitution specifically said the president could serve only 2 terms. All right?
Yeah.
But in 2008, the president had the constitution changed very easily to allow him to
run for another term. Oh my God.
So the president of Cameroon, who has been president since 1982, is still president today. And he's serving a term that ends in 2025. You see, so, but Cameroon is not alone. You had the same problem in Uganda. Uganda had a new constitution that had term limits and age limits. So the president, Museveni, had the constitution changed so that he could run again and again and again. But then so he got rid of the term limits, and then he faced the age limit. Then he got the constitution change again to get rid of the age limits. So he's in power now, and a lot of people in Uganda are now complaining that Museveni got rid of Obote because he argued that Obote was a dictator. Now he's doing the same things that Obote was doing. And so, but you see, this is not limited to Uganda.
Yeah.
You have Rwanda. When Kagame came to power, Kagame was considered a messiah who was going to save Rwanda. And he did a lot of good things in Rwanda. But his term of the terms that he was supposed to serve in power expired. But he had the constitution changed so he could stay in government up to possibly up to the year 2030. So what happened is that, yes, African countries came up with new constitutions.
Yeah.
These new constitutions were supposed to provide opportunities for all groups to participate in government and the economy. These new constitutions were supposed to make sure that no one individual could act above the law. Okay? But you see, those constitutions didn't work that way. They were not structured to function in that process. On paper, it appeared that they were structured to function that way. But in reality, they didn't. Because, I mean, take Nigeria, for example, where you have police officers killing people at random, extrajudicial killings taking place all over the place, and nothing happens. You see, so you have the security forces in Cameroon killing Anglophones, and nothing happens. You have extrajudicial killings even in Kenya. You see, so the problem is that, yes, these countries were able to produce these constitutions, but you see, producing a constitution is one thing, practicing constitutionalism is another. So yes, you can have a constitution, but you still have to have a governing process that adequately constrains the executive, the government, those who work in government, so that they cannot engage in practices that are illegal, practices that oppress people. And so you have many countries with very nice constitutions, and various groups within the country are still being oppressed, just as they were oppressed before those constitutions came into power. Now, just so we don't miss this opportunity, there are some countries that did have constitutions, like Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Mauritius, Botswana, and those constitutions are working relatively well. They have problems, but the constitutions are working relatively well. For example, take Ghana, for example. After Ghana had a presidential election, the loser was not very happy about it. But instead of rallying his supporters and asking them to go on the streets and start start violence, he took his case to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court of Ghana ruled against him. And he accepted the ruling. You see, so you can see that the Supreme Court is functioning properly, is doing its job, and the political parties are obeying the law. They are not trying to act above the law. And you had the same thing in Kenya. After the 2003 election, there were riots in Kenya that resulted in the killing of over 1,000 people. The riotings were primarily by the losing party. But when Kenya came out with the constitution, its new constitution in 2010, okay, there was an election in 2017, and the losers were very angry. But this time, they took their case to the court, and the court invalidated the election and ordered a new one. You see, what is important about the Kenya experience is that the president, the incumbent president, had won the election, but it was invalidated. And that incumbent president was very angry, but he did not ask his followers to engage in violence. He accepted the court judgment. And then a new election was held, and the same person won, okay? And the loser went to court, and the court said, no, the election was done properly. And you see, so there were a lot of people were disgruntled in Kenya, but you did not see the type of violence that you had before. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that many Kenyans began to realize that it was more beneficial to them as a country to resolve their problems through the judiciary than to get on the streets and start killing each other. And so, yeah, Kenya is not yet there, but they are far, far better off than a lot of other African countries. You can say they've already started the journey, and they've gone a long way in their efforts to allow their laws and institutions to govern their behavior. And so, and you see the same system in South Africa, where the judiciary system has been very powerful in controlling the government. When the government of Zuma decided to withdraw South Africa from the International Criminal Court, okay, so the government of Zuma sends a letter to the UN and tells the UN, we are leaving the International Criminal Court. An NGO in South Africa went to court and said, you can do that because in order for South Africa to leave an international treaty, it has to go through Parliament. The executive does not have the power to
just decide that.
Right, to just decide and leave an international treaty that had been signed and ratified by South Africa. So a political party in South Africa took the case to court. The court ruled against the government. And what is important for other African countries to understand is that the government accepted the ruling. The government did not ignore the ruling. You see, so the South African government accepted the ruling and withdrew the petition that he had sent to the notice that he had sent to the UN, telling them that they will leave that South Africa will leave the ICC. So South Africa did not leave the ICC because it withdrew the petition. So you see there, the judicial system is doing the job it's supposed to be doing. When there is a conflict within the country, the conflict is taken to the courts, and the courts are the ones to rule on the constitutionality of the government decision. You see, this is something that is not happening in other African countries. And so to answer your question here is that, yes, many of these countries, many of these African countries did indeed have new constitutions, new institutions, but those institutions are not working the way they are supposed to work to provide the government with a way in which the government can promote peaceful coexistence and provide for all citizens to have an opportunity for self-actualization.
Thank you so much, Professor John. Our viewers and listeners, this was Professor John, Distinguished Professor of Economics, and John S. Hinckley Fellow at Weber State University. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and an attorney licensed to practice in the Supreme Court of the State of Utah, the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah, and the U.S. Supreme Court. His new book, Protecting Minority Rights in African Countries, A Constitutional Political Economy Approach, was published by the Edward Edgar Publishing House, and a copy can be accessed on the links that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Professor John, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.